When the bosses first arrived at the camp, the air was thick with the smell of smoke and summer. It wasn't the sharp kind that came from burning wood, but the softer, sweeter scent of something roasting over open flames. The women stepped down from the buses, weary, silent, cautious. Behind the wire fence, a few American soldiers stood around a grill, turning bright yellow cobs of corn with metal tongs. Helga Richter noticed it first. She tilted her head and frowned, the corners of her mouth curling into disbelief. "They're grilling animal feed," she muttered. The women around her chuckled under their breath, some shaking their heads. For them, corn was something they had only seen in sacks marked for livestock, not food to be enjoyed by people. One of the guards waved politely, offering a smile that none of the women returned. He turned back to the grill, brushed melted butter across the golden kernels, and took a bite right off the cob. The sight made Helga snort. "This is what they eat? No wonder they think they're free," she whispered to her friend beside her. The others laughed again, quietly but cruelly, the kind of laughter people use to make the unfamiliar feel smaller. That night, as they were led into their barracks, the smell still hung in the air, warm, heavy, and strangely comforting. It drifted through the thin walls, reminding Helga of home, of the kitchen she used to work in before the world became uniform and gray. But she pushed the thought aside. There was no place for nostalgia here. The days that followed moved with a rhythm she hadn't expected. The camp wasn't what she imagined. There were no shouting guards, no cruel punishments, only work, routine, and a strange sense of order. The women were assigned tasks, given rations, and allowed to attend small classes where they learned basic English, sewing, and even gardening. It was during one of those afternoons that Helga's curiosity began to stir. She noticed the Americans treated food with a kind of pride. They spoke about it, shared it, even argued over it. She couldn't understand it at first. Food, to her, had always been about survival, not joy. One Saturday she was told to help in the kitchen, a small wooden building that smelled of flour and coffee. A young American woman with rolled-up sleeves and flour on her cheek smiled and handed her a bowl. "You'll help me today," she said slowly. Helga nodded, pretending not to understand. But as she worked, she couldn't ignore the tray near the stove, a pile of bright yellow cobs, freshly steamed and glistening with butter. The woman caught her staring and said with a grin, "Corn? Try." Helga shook her head quickly. "No, for animals." The woman laughed softly and pointed to herself. "Animal?" The moment was small, but it lingered. That night, Helga lay awake, the taste of butter still faint in the air. She began to wonder, what if everything she had been told wasn't the whole truth? What if the world outside her borders had been growing, learning, creating things she'd never imagined possible? When morning came, she found herself at the kitchen door again. The young woman smiled, said nothing, and handed her a plate. On it sat half a cob of corn, golden and steaming. Helga hesitated. Then, with a quiet breath, she took a bite. The sweetness surprised her first, soft, delicate, nothing like the coarse feed she remembered. The texture melted, the butter mingling with warmth and salt. She blinked, unsure whether to swallow or smile. For the first time in years, something inside her shifted. It wasn't just the taste of corn that changed her that day. It was the realization that an entire world existed beyond what she'd been taught to believe. The next morning, Helga woke before dawn. The barracks were still dark, the air heavy with the breath of sleeping women. She slipped quietly from her cot, wrapped her shawl around her shoulders, and stepped outside into the mist. The camp was still, only the faint hum of the guard's radio echoed somewhere near the gate. And then, faintly, she smelled it again, that same warm scent of roasted corn drifting through the early air. Something in her chest tightened. She didn't understand it, not fully, that strange pull between pride and curiosity. All her life she'd been taught to measure the world in categories, good and bad, strong and weak, civilized and crude. Food had been no different. In her mind, the Americans had simply been foolish people who mistook animal feed for delicacy. But now she wasn't so sure. When breakfast came, she found herself looking at the tray of food differently. The oatmeal, the fruit, the milk, everything had a balance to it, a sense of care. It wasn't luxury. It was something else, something she hadn't felt in a long time, abundance without arrogance. Later that day, the young kitchen worker, her name was Clara, waved her over again. Helga hesitated, but followed. The smell of baking bread filled the small kitchen. On the counter sat a basket of bright, golden kernels. Clara motioned for her to help grind them. Helga frowned. "For feed?" she asked. Clara shook her head. "For bread." Together they worked in silence. The mill turned slowly, the sound rhythmic and steady. As they mixed the cornmeal with flour and milk, Clara began to hum softly, an old song Helga didn't recognize, but somehow it sounded like home. When the bread came out of the oven, its crust was golden, the edges crisp. Clara cut 2 small pieces and offered one to her. Helga took it, almost afraid of what she might find. But when she bit into it, something inside her melted. It was sweet, soft, full of warmth. The flavor filled her mouth, simple yet profound. She looked at Clara, who smiled and said just one word, "Good." Helga nodded. Yes, good. That evening she couldn't stop thinking about it. The taste lingered like a song she couldn't forget. She thought about her mother's kitchen in Leipzig, where they'd baked rye bread so dark it almost looked black. It had been dense, heavy, something that fed the body, but never the heart. This was different. This was food that felt alive. Word spread quickly among the women. One afternoon when Clara served cornbread with honey, even the most skeptical among them lined up for a piece. Some giggled nervously, pretending not to care. But when they took their first bites, their faces softened. Someone whispered, "It's not so bad," and laughter rippled through the room, not mocking this time, but surprised, delighted. From then on, every week, a small group of them volunteered to help in the kitchen. They learned to make cornbread, soups, and even pies, dishes they'd never imagined. What had begun as a chore became a kind of quiet exchange. Clara taught them recipes, and in return they taught her songs from home. One evening, after the others had left, Clara handed Helga a small notebook. "Recipes," she said slowly. "Yours too, right." Helga ran her fingers over the cover. A simple notebook bound with string. She hesitated, then began to write. Not just recipes, but memories of her mother's kitchen, the smell of yeast, the feeling of kneading dough on cold mornings. Each line felt like reclaiming a piece of herself. Weeks turned into months. The bitterness that had once filled the camp began to fade, replaced by the soft rhythm of daily life. The women still missed home, still longed for news, but there was laughter now and the kind of calm that grows only where kindness has been planted. Helga often sat by the kitchen door, watching the fields beyond the fence. Corn grew there, tall and golden, swaying in the breeze. She thought about how wrong she had been, not just about the food, but about the people who had offered it to her. It wasn't the corn that changed her. It was the humility of realizing that the world was bigger than she had ever been taught to believe. And as the sun set behind the fields, Helga whispered softly to herself, not in shame, but in wonder, "Maybe this is what freedom tastes like." When the gates finally opened and the women were told they could return home, Helga didn't feel the rush of joy she had once imagined. She looked beyond the fence, at the road stretching into the distance, and realized she had no idea what waited for her anymore. The world she had known was gone. Cities broken, families scattered, streets renamed. The only thing she carried that still felt real was the small notebook Clara had given her. Inside were pages filled with flower-stained memories, recipes, notes, and bits of English phrases scribbled in careful handwriting. She kept it close during the long journey back to Europe. The train clattered through landscapes of emptiness, fields stripped bare, towns reduced to rubble, faces hollow with hunger. But every time she opened that notebook, she felt warmth again, the smell of the camp kitchen, the laughter that had somehow returned after so much silence, the taste of something golden and sweet. When she finally arrived in her hometown, it was quiet, too quiet. The bakery where she had once apprenticed was nothing more than a hollow shell of brick. Her family's house stood empty, its windows boarded, its garden overgrown. She sat on the front step for a long time before she had the courage to go inside. Dust hung in the air like fog. On the table lay a single rusted spoon. For days she wandered through what was left of the town, helping neighbors repair roofs, patch fences, share what little food they had. But the hunger was deep, not just for bread, but for hope. People had forgotten what life tasted like. One morning, Helga visited the local mill. The owner, an old man with trembling hands, told her the same thing everyone said. There was no wheat left, no rye, no barley, only corn. "We feed it to the animals," he muttered, shaking his head. Helga smiled faintly. "Or we could feed it to people," he frowned. "People don't eat that." "Then maybe they should," she said simply. That afternoon she began to work. With a borrowed pan and a handful of kernels, she ground, mixed, and baked. The smell rose through the tiny kitchen, warm, sweet, familiar. The neighbors came, one by one, drawn by curiosity. She cut the loaf into pieces and handed it out silently. At first they were hesitant. One man wrinkled his nose. "Cornbread, for people." "Try it," she said. He did, and his eyes widened. The sweetness surprised him, just as it once had surprised her. Others followed. Soon the room filled with laughter, the kind that had been missing for years. For a moment they weren't thinking of loss or ruin. They were simply tasting something that felt like life again. Within weeks, word spread. Farmers came to ask how she had made it. She showed them the process, how to grind the corn fine, how to mix it with milk or water, how to bake it slowly until it turned golden. The recipe traveled from one village to the next, carried by hands that still trembled, but had hope again. Helga began to write letters, to agricultural offices, to teaching programs, even to newspapers. She spoke of the grain that could save them, the crop that grew quickly and gave warmth when nothing else could. At first, few listened. But then the first harvest came, and the fields turned gold again. People began to call her the woman of the yellow bread. She didn't like the name. It sounded too grand for what she had done. But deep down she knew it wasn't just bread she had given them. It was a reminder that the things we mock, the things we call worthless, sometimes hold the key to renewal. Every time she baked, she thought of Clara, of her smile, her patience, her quiet kindness. One evening, as she wrote by candlelight, Helga copied a phrase she remembered from the camp wall. Understanding begins at the table. She underlined it twice, and as the candle flickered out, she whispered, "Yes, and maybe forgiveness, too." The years passed quietly, the way years often do when work becomes a kind of prayer. The land healed slowly, and so did the people. What had once been bare earth now shimmered each summer in gold, tall rows of corn swaying in the breeze like a choir that never tired of singing. Helga never tired of watching it. She had grown older, her hands lined and strong, her hair streaked with silver. The little mill had long since become a community bakery and teaching hall. Young women came from nearby towns to learn not just how to bake, but how to rebuild, how to take what others dismissed and turn it into something lasting. Every morning, Helga still rose before dawn. She would light the oven, grind the corn herself, and wait for that familiar smell to fill the room, that soft, sweet scent that had once crossed oceans and changed her life. To anyone passing by, she might have looked like an ordinary baker, but to those who knew her story, she was something more, a keeper of memory, a quiet reminder that the smallest acts can reshape a world. Sometimes when visitors arrived from abroad, she would take them to the edge of her fields. The corn rustled softly in the wind. "It grows easily now," she'd say with a smile. People finally learned to trust it. She didn't talk much about the camp, not because she wanted to forget, but because she had made peace with remembering. What had once been humiliation had turned into understanding. What had once been laughter at ignorance had become gratitude for learning. One afternoon, as she sat outside the bakery with a group of young students, one of them asked, "Frau Richter, is it true that you first tasted corn in another country?" Helga paused, smiling faintly. "Yes, and I laughed at it before I ever tried it." "Why?" She looked at the golden field in the distance. "Because I didn't know what I was seeing. I thought I understood the world. But the truth is, I only knew my corner of it." The student nodded thoughtfully, but Helga could tell he didn't yet grasp what she meant. Maybe he would one day. That night, after everyone had gone home, she stayed by the oven long after the last loaf had cooled. The light from the fire danced across the walls, flickering like the memory of voices long gone. She took out her old notebook, its pages now yellowed and soft at the edges, and turned to the very first recipe. Clara had written in English, "Cornbread, with love." Her hand trembled as she traced the words. "With love," she whispered as if repeating a prayer. Outside, the wind moved through the cornfields, carrying the sound of leaves brushing against one another like gentle applause. For a moment she could almost hear Clara's laughter again, see the kindness in her eyes, feel the simple joy of discovery that had once bridged an ocean between two strangers. Helga closed the notebook and smiled. "The world can change," she murmured, one taste at a time. She rose, turned off the oven, and blew out the candle. The fields outside glowed faintly under the moonlight, endless rows of gold, bending with the night breeze, whispering the same quiet truth she had carried all her life. that even the humblest grain, when shared with open hands, can feed more than hunger. It can feed the heart. There are stories that don't make it into history books, stories that happen quietly, around kitchen tables, inside humble rooms where people rediscover what it means to be human. This was one of them. Helga's story was never about food. It was about how something as simple as a loaf of bread or a cob of corn can teach us more about understanding than any lecture or headline ever could. In a time when the world was divided by pride, she learned that truth sometimes hides in the smallest things, in kindness, in curiosity, in the courage to taste what you once dismissed. The women who arrived in that camp came with the weight of a world's mistakes on their shoulders. They had been told what to believe, what to value, what to reject. But a single act of sharing, one meal, one moment of warmth, rewrote those beliefs. What began as laughter at something unworthy turned into discovery. What began as mockery became gratitude. And in the years that followed, Helga carried that lesson home. She didn't bring wealth or power. She brought seeds, recipes, and the memory of a kindness that had crossed borders without needing permission. Through her hands, cornfields grew again where the earth had been barren. Through her heart, an entire generation learned that understanding isn't born from fear, but from curiosity. Her life reminds us that the simplest gestures, a shared meal, an open heart, can outlast every wall built by ignorance. Because what we choose to laugh at often holds the very wisdom we need most. If you felt something while listening, that quiet reminder that humanity still lives in small, everyday acts, leave a comment below. Tell us what memory, what taste, or what moment taught you to see the world differently. Maybe it was a meal shared with someone unexpected. Maybe it was forgiveness you didn't think you could give. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be remembered, stories about ordinary people finding extraordinary humanity, please like, share, and subscribe to Backwin Stories. Because we're not just keeping history alive, we're keeping empathy alive, one story, one memory, one simple taste at a time.